Hi, James Perloff here. I've had a major project held up that I'd make this video. I'm often asked by people, especially members of the John Birch Society, when am I going to update my 1988 book, The Shadows of Power? That book, of course, was a history of the Council on Foreign Relations, and it was the Society's best-selling book for many years. And I think field staff would confirm it was the top recruiting tool that the Society used. And what I often tell people, what I usually tell them is I have updated the Shadows of Power. I did it in 2019. I'm sorry, 2013 with my book, Truth of the Lonely Warrior. And then in 2019 with 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw. But these books don't confine themselves to the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, because the New World Order, which is what these books describe, is much bigger than that. There are things that fall outside the purview of the CFR, like vaccines and weather control and secret societies and so forth. Um, and some of you know, I wrote a blog post in early 2024. It was called My Strange Encounters with Some of the John Birch Society Leadership over 39 years. And what caused me to write that post was that in late 2023, I was contacted by seven, in fact, leading members of the Birch Society who reported to me what had happened at a meeting in Appleton, Wisconsin, at John Birch Society headquarters. And at this meeting, some of the field staff demanded to know why my book, The Shadows of Power, had been made virtually unavailable. And the top executive replied that I was an anti-Semite and that he had been informed of this by the society's top recruiter in a phone call. Well, this is absurd. First of all, I'm half Jewish. And also, this recruiter is a friend of mine, and we used to travel for the John Birch Society. He would introduce me, I would give a PowerPoint talk, and then we would sell the Shadow of Power, and he would sign up people for the John Birch Society. Um, Now, this gentleman, this recruiter called me up after this meeting was reported in Appleton, and he told me, Jim, I have never called you an anti-Semite. And in fact, he told me that he had never, ever placed a phone call to this executive ever to discuss anything. So the phone call was a fabrication, either that or the executive had a very faulty memory. Now, since that time, um, that executive has been removed and some good things started happening in Appleton. And I wrote a post in late 2024 called Good Things Happening at the John Birch Society. And one of the things that happened was that the Shadows of Power was to be brought back. And the idea was that I would write an update specifically to that book, which I envisioned as a extensive afterword. Now, I was agreeable to this, and a conference was scheduled between me and the person who was to oversee the update. Um, and about a week before that conference, I received an email. It was not an unfriendly email, but the person said something in it. This person is still high ranking in Appleton. He said, quote, I too have had concerns about a couple of things you've written and said over the years. In fact, you probably recall the discussion we had in connection with the Hess manuscript. Well, what he was talking about was a set of three articles I submitted to the New American back in 2001 or 2002, probably two. And it was about Rudolf Hess' famous flight to Britain in 1941 and the mysterious aftermath of that event. And what I documented in those articles was that Germany was, in fact, attempting to end the war with Britain. They were not trying to conquer Britain. As mainstream historians and um, Hollywood movies have always claimed. Um, if anyone thinks I'm wrong about that, I would invite them to read Pat Buchanan's book, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, which confirms what I said. Okay. Um, but my articles, all three articles, were rejected by the New American. Rejection only occurred once prior to that. And I was actually expelled from the John Birch Society. I was what they call red starred and labeled Nazi or pro-Nazi because I said that Germany was not trying to conquer England. Um, uh, this is something I was not informed of, which is I didn't even know I'd been red starred to violation of the society's own policies. Um, if you'd like to read about that episode, you can find it in that blog post I mentioned, my strange encounters with some of the John Birch Society leadership. Um, I do want to stress that these articles were entirely true, entirely factual, and have since then been confirmed by other historians, including British historians. But I was rather chilled to find out that somebody in Appleton still remembered them and still considered them to make me a questionable person. By the way, in case anyone's wondering why I'm doing this as a video instead of a blog post, well, I already wrote two blog posts regarding the John Birch Society last year, and I just thought I'd change up the format. So I had a conference with the person in charge of overseeing the update. I'm not going to mention his name. After all, it was a private conversation, and it's always possible I might misremember or slightly misquote something that he said. But I did want to make people uh, aware of why I decided not to do the update. I believe I should start by mentioning how the Shadows of Power came to be. I started writing for the New American in 1986. The articles were well received. The one on Pearl Harbor was especially a big hit. And, you know, back then, when we talked about what we now call the deep state, we were in the Birch Society were using rather nebulous terms like the insiders and the establishment. I wanted to know specifically who these guys were. And, back in those days, there's no such thing as an internet, no such thing as a search engine. And the best window on who they were seemed to be the membership roster of the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, the CFR was the connection point between the oligarchs of America and the federal government. And I wanted to write something that would describe who these people were, what their history was, and how they influenced American foreign policy over the years. Um, it started out as an article for the New American, but it got to be too big for an article. So Buck Mann, who was the publisher of both the New American and Western Islands, which was the book publishing arm of the John Birch Society, said, let's make this into a book. So I did monumental research, reading many, many books and journal articles, and I sat in the Boston Public Library, went through every issue of Foreign Affairs, which is the journal of the CFR, started with this first issue of 1922, and I've got a lot of change in my pockets because I had to use the photocopy machine a lot. I still have my notes. Let me just show you. These are all photocopied sheets, um, separated by tab. Um, that's one. Um, Here's another. Um, these are all photocopied sheets. Okay. Um, Here's another. Um, Goes on, right? I mean, I have another sheet in a blue folder, which lists all the many of the past former membership rosters of the Council of Foreign Relations. Um, I didn't have a PC then. I didn't get my first home computer till 1989, and I as I wrote the book, I put all my ideas on note cards. I must have had hundreds of them, and I kept rearranging them to have them in the sequence that I wanted uh, to explain this topic to my readers. And then I wrote the book in pencil on line paper, and pencil gives you an eraser. And after I had that satisfactory, I then picked it up with a typewriter and gave that to the John Birch Society typesetters. I wanted to make this the best book possible. Um, I created an index for the book. A good book to be useful has to have an index. I created endnotes for documentation, and I also selected and captioned 126 photographs. Now, Buckman was very generous. He let me work with photographic agencies like the Bateman Archive and AP Wide World. I was requesting for them specific photographs that would support the book's content. And all of that hard work paid off. The book was a huge success. We did many printings of 10,000 copies at a time. We even did as many as 25,000 at one time. What I want to emphasize is this book was my idea. We put enormous labor into it. It's certainly true that the John Birch Society provided the typesetting, the cover design, occasionally incorporated an idea from Birch staff into the book. It was my baby, if let's use that term, and it was my creation, and it's copyrighted in my name. So naturally, I like to maintain a certain amount of creative control over that book. Get to this relatively recent conference, I told the individual overseeing the update that I was not going to do what I did in the Shadow of Power, where I had a chapter on each administration, each presidential administration. But I said what I would do is I would have one long postscript in which I divided it into subsections dealing with each administration. And the Shadows of Power had ended with Ronald Reagan, so I'd start with George H.W. Bush. I was not going to list all the CFR members in each administration, but I'd have a paragraph stating who the key CFR members were in each one. And then for George H.W. Bush, of course, I would include his famous New World Order speech. And when I got to Bill Clinton, I would mention Hillary Clinton's deferential remarks about the Council on Foreign Relations. And I said, in Shadows of Power, I talked about the Council and the Trilateral Commission. In this new book, I'm going to expand that to include the Bilderbergers and Klaus Schwab's World Economic Forum. So far, everything was very well received, but then things went really downhill quick. I said that discussing American foreign policy, and remember the name of the CFR is Council on Foreign Relations. I said in an update, I can't ignore or omit the 20-year war in Afghanistan or the 10-year war in Iran. Now, in the Shadows of Power, I discussed World War I and World War II in terms of globalism and communism. Globalism, World War I gave us the League of Nations, World War II gave us the UN. Communism, in World War I came the Soviet Union, which is the first communist state. In World War II expanded communism into China and Eastern Europe. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq had nothing to do with communism, and they had nothing to do with empowering the UN. But I'm going to have to mention Zionism here as an important factor in these wars. And he said that that would violate a long-standing policy of the John Birch Society. He said that the ADL, the Southern Poverty Justice Center, would label us anti-Semites if I did that. And he said that, in fact, he'd already labeled us anti-Semites. So afterwards, I went on the internet and I found that Rev is an article from the Southern Poverty Justice Center. It's called Ron Paul Birch, President to Speak at Anti-Semitic Conference. I'm smiling because it's a little bit humorous. Jack McManus, president of the John Birch Society, passed away recently. I knew him for about 40 years. He never uttered one anti-Semitic syllable, neither has Ron Paul. Um, but quote this article, it says, quote, beyond the obvious, the president, what do the president of the John Birch Society and former U.S. Representative Ron Paul have in common? In early September, the man is scheduled to speak along with a lengthy list of arch conservatives in a conference in Canada, sponsored by the Fatima Center, part of the radical traditionalist Catholic movement, perhaps the largest single group of hardcore anti-Semites in North America. That's ridiculous. The article provides not even one quote from Ron Paul or Jack McManus was anti-Semitic. It was just all innuendo. Um, Now, my view is, why do we have to worry about what these guys say? Um, they're going to smear us anyway. The people on the conservative right always get smeared. And but what about this long-standing policy of the John Birch Society? I think a lot of it goes back to a film that J. Edgar Griffin made for the Birch Society when he was with it back in the 1960s. You can still see this film on social media. It's posted often. And in this film, J. Edgar Griffin quoted a Communist Party directive from 1940. Here's what it said, quote, when certain obstructionists become too irritating, label them after suitable buildups as fascist or Nazi or anti-Semitic, and use the prestige of anti-fascist and tolerant organizations to discredit them. In the public mind, constantly associate those who oppose us with those names which already have a bad smell. Quote. I'm very familiar with this quote. I had it in the Shadows of Power. But as I explained to the individual overseeing the update, Edward Griffin now openly criticizes Israel and Zionism. I know that because I get his newsletter called Need to Know. And he's not afraid of being labeled an anti Semite. Pastor Chuck Baldwin, former presidential candidate for the Constitution Party, openly criticizes Zionism. He's not afraid of being labeled an anti Semite. Candace Owens, one of the most popular figures in conservatism today, um, bitterly criticized Israel and Zionism. In fact, she recently did an interview with one of the survivors of the USS Liberty. Now, if you don't know the story, in 1967, the USS Liberty, which is an intelligence ship, it was only armed with four 50 caliber machine guns, was viciously attacked by the Israelis. They flew in unmarked planes and torpedo boats, and they attacked with cannon fire, rockets, napalm. They torpedoed the Liberty, but it did not sink. Um, they even machine gunned the lifeboats, which were flying. They knew it was an American ship. It was flying the American flag, which they shot down. The sailors then hoisted another American flag, which they shot down. And then the Liberty hosted a huge ceremonial American flag, which the Israelis also shot down. And we know from decoded air to ground, I'm sorry, ground to air transmissions that the Israelis knew it was an American ship and they were under orders to sink her with no survivors on board. And the idea was to sink the ship, blame it on Egypt, and bring America into the war on Israel's side, just like the Lusitania and the USS Maine. Um, I have an article about it on my website. It's called Remember the Liberty, but don't take my word for it. Go to the website, the survivors of the U.S. Liberty, which is gtr5.com. Again, that is gtr5.com. As the New American discussed the USS Liberty, I checked their website. I could find no mention of the Liberty, other than a few comments posted by readers in comment sections. No, Candace Owens, she talks about it, and she's got over 6 million followers on Twitter. The Birch Society has 22,000 followers. That means that Candace has 400 followers for every one follower that the Birch Society has. In fact, I have more followers on Twitter than the Birch Society. That's in spite of being brutally shadow banned for the last 3 years. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I tried to start a new account on Twitter, and they shut it down after just 1 week. But anyway, I pointed out to this individual that if people like Jody Griffin and Candace Owens and Pastor Chuck Baldwin are willing to criticize Zionism, it shouldn't be a problem for us. But he still said no. And I said, look, here's what I'll do. I will put a disclaimer in the update. I will say that my views on Zionism are my own and should not be construed as those of the John Birch Society. He still refused. And I said, look, an update to the Shadows of Power is going to be a lot of work. I'm going to have to do research, go through back copies of the New American, I'm sorry, Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the CFR. And I have to create endnotes, and I'm not going to do all that work if you guys just toss it in the dumpster because I made a few comments about Zionism. So he said, well, send us what your comments are about Zionism and we'll decide. But after the phone call, I thought it over and I said, I'm up against a brick wall here and I'm not going to water down my remarks over this outdated policy. And so I sent him an email and simply said, I've decided not to continue with the update. I didn't give my reason because if I said I'm not going to update it or on the issue of Zionism, I'm going to start another rumor in the Birch Society leadership that was an anti-Semite. So I just left it neutral and said, we're just not going to continue with the project. I want to make a general observation here. If I criticize the United States government, I mean I hate all Americans. I mean, I criticize the Biden administration. Does that mean I hate all Americans? Obviously not. Um, when I was writing for the John Birch Society, I wrote criticisms of the communist government of the Soviet Union. Does that mean I'm a racist who hates all ethnic Russians? Of course not. I criticized the government of Red China. Now, does criticizing Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution, does that mean I hate all Chinese people? No, my wife is Chinese. We've been married for 34 years, and her father actually fled um, China to go to Taiwan in 1949 to escape the communists. He had nothing but the shirt on his. I've criticized the government of Fidel Castro. Does that mean that I hate all Cubans? I'm a racist who hates all Cubans? Obviously not. Criticize the government of a country does not mean you hate all the people underneath that government. But watch how it changes when we move over to Israel. If I say something critical of the Israeli government, whether it is attacking the U.S.'s liberty or bombing Gaza, automatically, in some people's views, that means I'm an anti-Semite, I'm a Nazi, I'm a racist, I'm a bigot, and I hate all Jews. But it's ridiculous. My father was Jewish. I mean, what are you going to do with organizations like Naturi Karta? Naturi Karta is an organization of Orthodox Jews who bitterly oppose Zionism. They burn the Israeli flag. So what are you going to do with these Orthodox Jews? Are you going to claim that they're anti-Semites? That is ridiculous. Um, it's It's what George Orwell in 1984 called doublethink. You've got these two separate ideas in your head, which are completely contradictory. You have one standard for all the other nations of the world, but for one foreign country, you have another standard. And I want to close by quoting some excerpts from a book. I'll let you know what the book is when I'm done. Quote, following the First World War, the League of Nations had given Great Britain a mandate over Palestine. After 30 years of bloody confrontations with Zionist terror groups, Great Britain gave up her efforts to stop illegal Jewish immigration. Now, the author goes on to describe how the UN partitioned Palestine into areas for Palestinians and for immigrating Jews. Beginning with the quotes, they're just excerpts. Quote, but this was not the way the Zionists from Theodore Herzl to David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Dayan meant to establish Jerusalem's sovereignty in the Middle East. And these were not the borders that they had in mind. In pursuit of their dream, they were foolishly encouraged by the powerful American supporters in the White House and the Capitol. All the American presidents and all the American Congresses from the Truman administration to the present must bear the responsibility. The exceptionally hasty recognition of the Zionist proclaimed republic of the United States. I'll just mention here, Harry Truman recognized Israel 11 minutes after the state of Israel was proclaimed. Because this violated the solemn written promise of President Truman's predecessor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the King Saud of Saudi Arabia, the United States would not condone Zionist designs to establish a Jewish state in the Arab countries. President Truman thus placed his country openly and officially in an exclusively pro-Israel position that has never been abandoned by his successors. Zionist terror warfare against the Arabs had commenced long before the proclamation of the Israeli Republic. The gangs that had been responsible for the ambush of so many British officers and soldiers for the dynamiting of a hotel in Jerusalem where 91 persons, mostly civilians, were killed, were now armed with mysteriously acquired American Lend-Lease weapons. They were turned loose against the Palestinian population. The terror was systematic, designed to provoke the exodus of the native inhabitants to make room for the intruders. In July 1946, almost 2 years before the proclamation of the Israeli Republic, 250 villagers, most of them women and children, were wantonly massacred at Deir Yassin. Similar slaughter accompanied every new advance of Zionism in Palestine, some of which he described. The results of this system of conquest were indeed startling, and it is impossible to say the Zionists have not made a success of it. There are today about 2.7 million Arab refugees from Palestine, including 1.6 million who've been leading human existence in filthy tent camps for years. The question is whether the Truman administration and those that followed it in Washington were serving or betraying America's interest, and those of the free world when they chose as allies and champions of America's interest in the Middle East 2.5 million recently immigrated Jews and thereby deliberately flung into the arms of the Soviets, follow the Middle East 120 million Arabs. It might be asked what loyalty means in a high government official and political leader if it does not mean, first of all, loyalty to his own country. The repeated Israeli victories over the Arab forces, victories due wholly to American military collaboration, far from being victories over the other superpowers' ambitions, meaning at that time the Soviet Union, as some American diplomatic authority would have us believe, have started a violent and perhaps irreversible anti-American reaction among 120 million Arabs, with the risk of an area containing two-thirds of the world's known oil reserves, and that of the U.S. being forced into a Vietnam-style war in the Middle East, which the United States might have to fight. And I would say that it was very prophetic because I think that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq could well compare to the 11-year war in Vietnam, even though they were fought in the desert, in the jungle. You know what book I'm reading? It's a book published by the John Birch Society in 1976, Betrayal by Rulers, by Prince Michael Sturza, former foreign minister of Romania. And obviously the Birch Society thought a lot of Prince Sturza. Here what it said on the back of the book. Serious as his charges are, Prince Sturza's credentials are of equal magnitude. Few commentators on current affairs can even approach his experience and expertise. You know where I bought this book? I bought it at John Birch Society headquarters in Belmont, Massachusetts in the late 1970s at their American Opinion bookstore. You know, Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society, permitted this book to be published. And it documented the crimes of Israel, its acts of terrorism, suppression of the Palestinians, and criticized American Zionist foreign policy. But I'm warned that I can't write anything about Zionism in an update to the Shadows of Power. George wrote 15 pages. I wouldn't have even anywhere close to that. Now, I mean, facetious, but since Robert Welch permitted publication of this book, perhaps the John Birch Society should do to him what they've done to me in the past. Label him anti-Semite, red star him, expel him from the society, and erase his memory from the history of the Birch Society. Now, I do want to say this. It's important to add balance here. I've known many, many grassroots birchers over the years, and they are good people. They are patriots. They are constitutionalists. They hold traditional Christian values. I want to say that the John Birch Society does excellent work in opposing globalism, communism. It's organized chapters of activists across the nation who oppose harmful legislation like gun control legislation, et cetera, et cetera. But the reason I canceled the Shadows of Power update was not because I have a problem. The reason I canceled it is because the Birch Society has an internal policy problem. They're still living in fear of that 1943 Communist Party directive. And, you know, that was written 82 years ago. And today there's an internet. And people are hip to the fact that Israel is not our greatest ally, but they have actually hurt us on many occasions. And saying that the Israeli government must not be held accountable for what it does, a standard we would never apply to our own government. Let's put it in a foreign country above your own country. Let me say this, the Birch Society is not going to gain recruits by continuing this policy. They're going to lose far more recruits than they'll gain by continuing to cover up the crimes of Zionism. Because too many people today know the truth about it. If you can conceal that truth, many people will just consider you a limited hangout. Thanks for listening.